Okay, here we are for our weekly discussion. And so let's see, we've covered John Cage, we covered Herbert Brunn in our conversations leading up to today. We talked about that we would start to focus on some of these interesting graphic scores that and various approaches to making graphic scores that composers have had. And I thought maybe we could start with a little historical perspective, seeing as how we covered some in-depth stuff on Cage and Brunn, including those three big graphic pieces of his, and then Cage had a variety of different sort of approaches to notation and things. But maybe you could kind of give us a thumbnail sketch, if you will, of getting to the point where we have this sort of explosion of different notational approaches for percussion, and then after we've sort of done that, next week maybe we could detail a few of those scores.
Very much appreciating the offer, the incentive from you to dig through all of this stuff. I should show you what's sitting here on my floor. I went through all of my boxes and files, and some of it was, well, as you would know from knowing me, slightly organized. And it is surprising how much one remembers why certain little piles of scores or composers or would be in this box or that box or what. So I did collect all of these things and spent a little bit of time thinking through what is sort of the first quarter century or so of this kind of activity, and there are probably 40 or so scores here that are precious to me, and otherwise kind of fun and interesting and curious. And as you say, maybe the best idea would be for me to join the 21st century, and by next week, I could scan an example of each page or so of each of these 40 scores from basically from 1950, 51 through into the 70s. In looking at these ones, I found that, of course, most of them are from the 60s, or at least what I collected. I have a big collection of most of them are quite beautiful. I mean, some of them are way to the end of being a piece of art,
right?
And others, there was no intention of them to be beautiful in that sense. They were just meant to be somehow inviting an incentive to different kinds of thought processes for a musician. And I was trying to think of why. I'm not even sure exactly why I was attracted to this, but looking through this whole collection, it seems that since I was an undergraduate student, and why do I have the original printing of the Cornelius Cardew treatise, which was done by an art gallery in Buffalo? I mean, it's now, since then, it was finally published by Peters, and it comes in a different thing. For some reason, even as a student, as an undergraduate student, there's something attractive about this kind of thing to me, and I made a little bit of an effort to find these things, whatever. So there's this collection of things, and one of the things that came to mind in looking at it today, and you and I have talked about this as well, the whole the history of percussion literature beginning little attempts in the mid-1930s, and we can trace the whole thing. I enjoy, we've had that discussion, from Mahler coming out of the orchestra and Varese actually that ionization is really just the orchestra piece Amerique without the rest of the orchestra.
Right.
With an ionization, you just got rid of the rest of the orchestra. So we follow this all the way through, and then at the time of the Second World War, there's quite an interruption. And when composers came back after the Second World War, that whole period, by then, and partly because of the technology developed by governments at that time, electronic music, we have the real birth of electronic music, and many composers who had been interested in percussion, quite understandably, were fascinated with this idea of electronic music, to doing all of that kind of timbral composition in that way. And how that relates to these scores now for me is that early on in all of that, one comes to realize that sometimes it was sufficient for composers. You didn't need a score, you just made the piece and it played on a tape. Sometimes there are pieces from that era which are tape. They were reel-to-reel tape pieces, fixed media, where the composer would still, being in this whole history of the European discipline of the composer, who makes a score, they would go back and write a score, and develop kind of a pictorial way to graph out their electronic music scores. And then one of the first ones where we as percussionists actually interface with this doesn't come until 1961, which sounds like a very long time ago, but already was a little bit into this story when Stockhausen made his big piece called Kontakte, just contact. And the contact was between electronic music and and two live players, a percussionist and a pianist. So in that score, because it was up to that time certainly the most, it's like half an hour of music, it was more sophisticated than one could just turn on a stopwatch and do it. Well, also Stockhausen was obsessive about these things. I mean, maybe you could have run the whole thing, but he really wanted you to understand what the cues were, what it is, at 57.26 seconds. I mean, it's all written out in hundredths of a second as he measured his reels of tape. Well, what is it that I'm supposed to actually line up with, or how do I, those kinds of things. So that score, that beautiful score from 1961, the percussion looks, relatively normal. There's nothing unusually. It's floating all over the page like an orchestral score where different instruments are floating in different places, and the pianist is on the bottom with normal piano score. But then there's this beautiful drawing of all of the electronic sounds, which Stockhausen just had to invent. What didn't matter. There was no established way to graph these kinds of things. So I'm thinking that's one of the places that this kind of thing started. Though, as you pointed out, that's already some years after Cage had begun doing some of these things. And in looking through my things, I was I must say, I was surprised to be reminded. Let me claim that I was reminded that the first thing that I can find in my whole collection, the very first one of anything, is a piano piece by Morton Feldman from 1951. So that predates anything that I know of Cage being, very fanciful, particularly fanciful with his notations, or anybody else. And most of us know what the King of Denmark looks like. It's these boxes. It's just graph paper. It's clearly, actually, it was once printed, Feldman's original manuscript, and you see that it was, in fact, a big page of graph paper, and it's even organized a little bit differently than the final printed version. But that piece from 1964 was, in fact, almost maybe the final piece that he ever did in that box notation. As early as 1951, as a young man, what he had noticed, I think, and what he and Cage and Christian Wolfe and Earle Brown were, one of the things they were talking about at that time, and you can read the articles, the conversations, the question that the piano pieces, let's say, of Stockhausen and Boulez that come at the very end of the 40s and right into the early 50s, are these, depending upon your aesthetic, I'm going to say they're beautiful pieces, that are using the entire 88 keys of the piano and their various levels of post-Webern serialism. So they're just incredibly sophisticated. And if one cares about these things, it's my experience has always been that listening to Boulez, he sounds like the heir to Debussy and Ravel writing in a new style. Whereas Stockhausen sounds like the heir to Beethoven and sort of. However, I think the point of the Americans, the New Yorkers at that point, was
so-called New York School, right? Where this group,
the New York School. These things are all, they get named at you.
Yeah, later.
When you're doing it, you don't realize you're doing anything. Hanging out, and later there are books and names, which is good. It's a way we can talk about it. So what they notice is, these pieces aren't. It's hard to hear it's hard to get to hear these pieces. Even the recording industry, there aren't a lot of LPs, of Boulez piano sonatas in 1950. You go to a concert, you hear it once, and maybe a few people could get a score and look at it. And Feldman's what he observes in this context was, what's interesting, I can't follow, the tone row as it's, splattered all over the 88 keys and all of that stuff. What's interesting about the piece is how he controls density and the trajectory of tension and release and all of those kinds of things. So I wonder if a person could do that without, not that, I don't mean to imply that Feldman was being lazy about it in any way. He was just curious. So that's why, we can even look at this. So here it is. And he just divides the piano keyboard into low, middle, and high. And he's controlling he's saying, you know what? It doesn't actually matter which notes you hit, way up here or way down there, or what would happen if I just filled in all of these spaces and compose the structure, the shape, the densities, all that kind of stuff. So that even precedes Earle Brown. Maybe we'll look at next week. We often think about Earle Brown, December 1952, or Four Systems, which is from 54. They actually don't look that much different from the Feldman, right? We'll look at them next week, or I'll put them on the screen. But they're these blocks of sound. They look like they were originally drawn out on graph paper and just filled in different floating thicknesses of blocks of sound.
Yeah.
And I was struck in thinking through this all in the last week, how similar sort of they look to this Feldman piano piece graph. So,
and that the Feldman was, what did you say, 1951?
yeah, 1951.
Yeah, so he kept that, I mean, he kept that graphic style with the grid for many of those pieces. Of course, we would, the percussionists watching would recognize that same kind of notation for King of Denmark. So how many of those kinds of grid pieces did he do between those years? Do you know what other pieces are composed in that fashion?
You know, there are a number of piano pieces. There's a sonata. I'm sorry, he certainly doesn't call it that. There's a piece for violin and piano, and there is an orchestra piece. I think it's called the Straits of Magellan, actually. I think that's it. Or there might be more than one. An entire orchestra piece. And I wonder, I don't know, did he get it played? Did he organize people to do it? I don't know. But it's also quite interesting. I've seen examples, just certain score pages of that, where the orchestral percussion, you know, it may very well be that, I mean, again, that I think that's from maybe 1958. Somehow that date sticks in my ear for that piece. So somewhere between the first time he made a graph and pretty much at the end of his graphing, the percussion solo, there was a piece which included a section of 4 percussionists, which looks very similar than if you just look at the percussion part of that graph. It looks like King of Denmark because he had already thought of controlling triangles and bells and ringing sounds and dead sounds and little conglomerate sounds. It's all sort of there already. So his idea, in fact, okay, so that means that he had done that before Stockhausen did Zickler's. But you know, Feldman then always liked to tell the story that you know, he wanted to write a Jewish Zickler's. He thought Zickler's was, you know, clearly, you know, a very powerful, typical Germanic piece, and he wanted something gentle and contemplative and thoughtfully historical from his culture. Anyway, I think also that I mean, that Brown and Feldman and Wolf, who were younger, a little bit younger,
yeah.
and in the circle, especially Christian Wolf, who's the only one still alive, were young people, you know, in the circle of all of these discussions with Cage. And Earle Brown's wife, you remember Carolyn Brown, was a principal dancer with the Merce Cunningham Company. So that was actually how Earle Brown kind of even got into this whole fold. And I think the whole thing of Cage, as we talked about probably a couple of weeks ago, about Cage's response to having to write for the dance. I need a block of sound, 1 minute. Now I need a different block of sound for 20 seconds. Now, you know, that Earle Brown would also have been very familiar with this kind of give me a block of sound, give me a block of sound, you know, kind of composition.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the piece that his December 1952. Mm-hmm. That's the one that always often gets pointed to. And I remember when I was even an undergrad looking at the Grout book, you know, and there's the picture of the Earle Brown score. That's a pretty iconic one, but also very enigmatic. I mean, for all of these graphic pieces that we're talking about, I mean, Zicklus has pages of instruction. You know, the cage stuff always comes with lots of instructions. But that one, if there are instructions, I remember them being very, yeah, I remember them being very thin.
Yeah. You know, like many of these things, you know, it's sort of big, as you see, and it came in this thing, folio 1952-53, and 4 systems from 1954, and then in this opening page of, you know,
Yeah.
so but it's more like a diary, you know. It's I mean, it's, you know, it's October 52 for piano, November 52 for etc. And this isn't it. This one here.
That's what I remember. That spatialization was.
Yeah, and that's the one, as you see, for December 1952.
Yeah.
That he was imagining that when you look at that picture. And sorry, yeah, okay.
Right, that's the one.
How did he got away with that?
But he imagined this to be a spatial kind of composition somehow.
Yes, yeah. So if you then go back to that 3-dimensional box, you know, that some things are that. Well, what it means is that in one sense these things don't necessarily mean anything. Right?
Yeah.
It just means that something, you might interpret something as being very, very near to you or very far away from you, or and you're right, he doesn't really say much about it, that he was fascinated with the idea that you could begin to think of music. And again, I think this relates to a little bit also to the beginnings of electronic music, where for the first time composers were, shall we say, for the first time since Gabrielli, you know, in St. Mark's, with choirs of, you know, stereophonic brass. Sure, this was occasionally over the history of music, but it was great fun, and composers were really thinking about spatialization, distance, you know, up close, all of that.
This brings to mind a question that I think it would be good to hear from you on, which is, you know, you brought up Feldman and Boulez, and as not so much that Feldman was writing in a response to Boulez, but just as a way of achieving certain textures via graphic notation, certain gestures and textures. So I think we can say that Feldman, when he was composing those pieces, had in his mind's ear, an idea of exactly what he was making. He knew what those things were going to sort of sound like. Mm-hmm. And they were composed in a sense that he could imagine already what the sound would be. On the flip side of that are some of these, like Earle Brown's, where it's like, there maybe, I mean, who knows, maybe he had an idea of exactly what that would sound like, but it didn't get translated in the instructions or the score itself, that vision, that if he had something in his mind's ear. And I haven't read enough about Earle Brown to know what that might be, but it brings the question of different approaches to graphic notations, that some composers have used it in a sense to replace traditional notation in a way that they're composing music that they know exactly how it's going to sound. But then some composers are composing music, as you mentioned with Brun, like music they don't yet like, or music they don't yet know. And of course, you know, Mark Applebaum, a current example of that would be Mark Applebaum's Metaphysics of Notation, where he said that he didn't have an idea for what it would sound like. It was just a fanciful, beautiful score that he created. And then the resulting of that was whatever happened. So maybe you can talk about those two kinds of approaches.
Yeah, I think those two approaches have also then defined the development of the technique, if that's what it is, of being able to write a graphic score, to draw a score which graphically conveys these ideas, because if you want, in the case of Herbert Brunn with his computer programs, or in the case of Cage with almost every new thing he did, that he just kept coming up with the next completely different idea of how indeterminacy might engender something in a performer that would otherwise not, that neither Cage nor the performer would think of. I mean, that's on one extreme, and I think you would try to find notations which, and probably some of those are the ones that then become artistically beautiful or curiously interesting, for what they might elicit from a performer, that you have to, some of which have instructions and some of which have no instructions at all. You just look at it and think about it, and if you're you want to be honest with some integrity, how can I respond to this? Because, let me interrupt the thought and say that in most cases, there's kind of this third element here of improvisation, and to what extent composers were interested in eliciting from performers some spontaneity, to what extent it was exactly at this period that, for instance, Frederick Rzewski and Richard Teitelbaum and Alvin Curran, these were the first people in the group that they called Musica Electronica Viva, MEV, in Rome. They were all like postgraduate students on Fulbrights in Rome or something like that, and they started this improvisation group, which had elements of a live electronic music, and these guys, they've continued it throughout their whole lives. They were clearly making a statement about, I mean, if we're liberating sound the way Cage has led us, and we're not doing only post-Webern serialism here, that the creativity of improvisation was of tremendous interest to a whole genre of performers, kind of for the first time, that they were really paying attention to great players in the jazz world and thinking about, I mean, up until that time, I hadn't really thought about this, but other than organists who are supposed to be good improvisers, but they're improvising in the style of something, So there was a real cognizance on the part of the whole community right then. To what extent do we want to invite this? To what extent do we want to allow it or get a little bit of it? I mean, even Zicklus in that sense, for us, I mean, that's a real conversation. I think we know that Stockhausen's original idea was that there would be some spontaneity from the performer. He had gotten to the point of making electronic music where everything was calculated. He spliced the tape, he put it all together, and in that sense, he was responsible solely, and it was perfect. There was no, performer error or interpretation or anything. So why then should we have a performer? Well, let's have, what can the performer bring was an absolute question in Zicklus. It turns out that, at least for percussion, it's way too hard to do that piece on the fly, to make all of those, you need different sticks and you need to be physically in the position to do it and all of that. I think he couldn't really have even known that well as a composer sitting at his desk imagining what a percussionist might do. So the tradition of Xeroxing every page of Zicklus, cutting it out and making your own version, I think is not in any sense being uncourageous about it or doing a disjustice to it. He's been well aware in the rest of his life that to get really the kinds of accurate performances that he wished to have, that was the only way for a percussionist to do that. But the point that you were making here is that percussionists, all performers, are caught in the middle of this, improvising or following instructions. And the whole history of graphic music also, I think, has something to do with looking for all of the middle ground of this kind of stuff. So even as I was going through all of these scores and trying to, we don't have to have a definition, what constitutes a graphic score. Herbert's computer graphics have very little or nothing in visual commonality with traditional music notation. Whereas Zicklus, since we're on that example, has a great deal in common with it, is mostly, pretty traditional music notation. But it's also at this time, for the first time, that we start getting pieces which are just instructions. You just get pages of a process, or not even necessarily a process. It's still, there's a Barney Childs piece here from 1962, which is a whole stack of cards, and you just get all of these cards with little notations or things to do on them. So everything about non-traditional notation begins to explode, and many people are exploring different different avenues in this sort of thing.
Yeah.
So Cage and Brunn were two people who were quite adamantly against improvisation. As we said last week, Herbert himself was a great improviser as a jazz pianist, but in his concert music, he wasn't interested in what he used to call, your personal autobiographical bullshit.
What Cage would call your taste and memory.
Exactly. more elegantly.
Maybe more elegantly.
So anyways,
yeah. Yeah. Well, something that just in working with you on some of these graphic scores and just conversations over the years, thinking about making such things, the conversation comes up about improvisation and to what level are you, like if a composer has an idea. For instance, I had this idea of this thing that I wanted to do. I knew sort of what I wanted to do physically in my body. I want to do this thing, but I don't really want to fix it. I want to be able to, each performance, have elements of improvisation. And so that led me to a graphic notation, right? But something that you always come back to often when we have these conversations, or we're looking at a certain piece, is that the composer might arrive at an idea, right? In this case, of something they want to do, for whatever reason, elect to do a graphic notation piece, but then that notation on the paper elicits from you something different than you would just do if you were just improvising freely on this idea, on this concept. And I think that's really, to me, one of the most interesting things about graphic notation, is that you can become a collaborator with the composer in a way. So when I give this piece to someone else to play, I hope I should get the same thing that I wanted to do, but they'll have to wrestle with that notation. They'll have to engage with it in the same way that I engaged to come up with that.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah,
so there's this idea that graphic notation is a really unique way of bringing composer performer together in a sense. That it's not strictly it's not doing whatever you want. You're looking at this picture and then do something that you want to do. You really have to wrestle with it. But I guess the sticky part is that some pieces are have lots of instructions and have a clear idea, sort of circling back to what we were talking about. Some of these have a very clear idea and some of them don't. So how does a performer looking at one of those, the latter, how do they navigate those waters?
I suppose that you first have a responsibility to want what the composer wants. I mean, this is from day one of notation. You look at a Bach score and you can understand what it is that Bach wanted, and you understand also that that's very, very primitive notation for what was really going on in this guy's mind and heart. And it's not as literal as we might think. In fact, a little bit of a problem for us as percussionists, maybe two things, is one, that we get to be members of the club just at a time when music composition had gotten the most complex and specified as it maybe ever was. That even when in common practice period European concert music, yeah, there are metronome markings and there are instructions, push ahead, hold back, these kinds of things. And yet everybody knew that it's a living, breathing thing, and you have to make it work in your space, in your time. Chopin expected it to sound a little bit different on different pianos in different halls with different people. Whereas we get something and the metronome marking says, boom, it says this, and we look at all, it's, dynamics are serialized from 5 pianos to 5 Fs and every degree in between. And that's one side that, as I say, we get to join the club just when this is at its apex, and we're joining the club from being the people in every other culture for the whole history of mankind, humankind. Well, we're sort of the timekeepers. We're in fact supposed to be in the background keeping time, whether it's in a ritual in some community somewhere, or you're a jazz drummer, whatever. All of which mediates against a little bit this whole thing of the living, breathing organicness of what has traditionally been a way to play all of this, any of this kind of music. So when we say to want what the composer wants, it's not fair to find some graphic score and then have your own idea of what you would like to do. Oh, I always kind of wanted to do this crazy thing. So here's my excuse. I don't have to take responsibility. I can say,
there it is.
Yeah, this happens to John Cage. I sort of came to realize this in the relationship maybe with him, that though he came to be magnanimous about it, the more one reads all of his philosophy, the books, studies the scores, you can figure out what it is he was trying to make. Well, here's a good example. The composed improvisation for single-headed drums with or without jingles. You do all of your chance operations, you get your number of iktai, you get the various frame drums you're going to use, and people who would be drawn to this piece are probably people who have already a nice collection of ricks and who knows what from all over the place. I think it's not wanting what Cage wanted to then pick up your thing and do a very cool Middle Eastern groove. You do your coin tosses, or however you draw numbers out of a hat. 56 iktai is not really going to be count up to 56, but That's a simple and silly, but I've heard it happen, and I think we all have heard it happen.
Yeah.
So there's a thing. I mean, fine. You should write your own piece for a collection of Greeks, and beautiful, very cool. but don't put. But then take responsibility for it. You can't put John Cage's name on it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And similarly with all of these kind of pieces. That's part of the fun of it, actually, to be honest about it, and to become aware of this whole range of kinds of notations, and to find at what point in your life you fit somewhere. I've got things I'd like to improvise, but my skill is in knowing my instruments and my technique. I'm not so confident, I'm not so experienced in building structures and in keeping listeners engaged for 5, 10, 20 minutes. So some composer's graphic structure that I could use my contribution can be all the things I just said. The composer's contribution can be, keeping it on some sort of track in that sort of way. Mm-hmm.
Good. Well, this seems like a natural pause. So we'll come back next week with some specific scores, and we'll look at, be able to see the images of those notations and talk through some specifics. That sounds good.
Good.
All right. Very
Thanks.
good. All right.
Till then.